What is up, everyone? Welcome back to our channel. I'm Carla, and in this week's tutorial we are going to be making Cymbidium orchids out of sugar. I love orchids so much that I even had them in my own wedding bouquet when I married my husband. Mind you, they were fresh orchids and not sugar ones, but we are going to show you how to make the sugar kind with a bunch of realistic little details that will impress the crap out of anyone who sees them. So we hope you give them a go, and we're going to start right now. You will find a link in the description box below to our Gumpaste recipe, and you'll see here a full list of tools and materials you need. It can be helpful to know just a little about the anatomy of the orchid, as I'll be referring to these terms as we go. Typically, I see it as left arm, head, right arm, left leg, right leg. So we're going to get started making the petals and the sepals. I am starting with a very muted pink shade of Gumpaste here, rolled into a log and then pressed into the grooves of the cell board. I'm going to start rolling it out and then continue working the paste over the grooves in the board so that you can see the grooves showing through. Then flip your paste over, and I'm using the slightly rounded cutter here out of the Cymbidium orchid set, and you can see it's got a little point on the end. That is the sepal cutter, so you'll need 3 of those. And then here you'll see I'm using the tapered leaf-shaped cutter. That's for the petals, and you'll need 2 of those. Be sure to wrap and put away any Gumpaste that's not in use. I have 24 gauge white floral wire here that I've dipped into some water. You can use edible glue or egg whites. I'm just flattening the groove that was created by the cell board, adding a little cornstarch to prevent sticking, and then using my ball tool just to thin out and soften the blunt cut edge of the petal. I'm using a Cymbidium orchid veiner. You could use an all-purpose petal veiner for this. It will work just fine. Give it a good press in the veiner, and then put the petal back onto your foam pad and pick up your Dresden tool. I am just dragging the Dresden tool along the inside edge of the petal just to get it to curl back a little bit. This will add some movement and some interest to your orchids. And I'm just making sure that that petal comes to a nice point at the end and giving it a little pinch in between my fingers to add some movement. And I'm drying it here on a chocolate egg mold, which has a lovely rounded curve. And the petals, as you saw there, are being dried upside down. So I'm going to continue here with the sepals. These are the ones that are slightly more rounded at the ends. I'm adding the wire as before and just flattening out the groove from the cell board between my fingers, adding some cornstarch, and just smoothing out the edges with my ball tool. I'm not aiming to create too much ruffling here because Cymbidiums are not very ruffly. Give the sepal a good press in your veiner, and then place it back on your foam pad. We're going to do the same thing here that we did before with the Dresden tool and just create some movement just along the upper edge, mostly, of the sepal. You'll want to pinch the sepal at the tip and then pinch it at the base as well. And then in this particular case, we're going to dry it perpendicular on the egg mold. We're going to continue with the other 2 sepals, and you'll work them in the same way with your Dresden tool curling back the upper edge, and then also pinching the sepal at the tip to accentuate the point on the end, and pinching it at the base to create movement, And these two, you can dry them parallel to the first two petals that we put onto the tray. So you will end up with one sepal and another sepal with a gentle curve, the two petals also with a gentle curve, and then this final sepal with a very deep curve. We're now going to make the column, and this is the throat, which we'll make later. So to make the column, you need some 20 gauge white floral wire. You'll want to bend a hook in the end with your pliers, and this is the column mold. I'll show you a version in a little bit without the column mold if you don't have one or don't want to buy one. But you're going to roll a piece of gum paste into a kind of a flattened torpedo shape and just check it against the mold to make sure it fits. And then flatten it into the cavity of the mold and add the upper piece. Give the whole thing a really good squeeze, and you're going to get paste squishing out the edges as you see here. You actually want that to happen. Remove the column carefully from the mold. You'll see it's picked up lots of good texture. And use fine scissors to trim the paste that oozed out of the sides of your column mold. This doesn't have to be super tidy, as you can just smooth out the edges with your fingers, as you see here. And I'm just using the Dresden tool to create some indentations on the inside of the column. These will accentuate later by painting on some burgundy dots. And just make sure that the shape looks reasonably tidy. Grab your hooked wire, dip it in water or edible glue, and wipe off the excess. Insert it into the base of the column. You want the wire to go halfway up or so. And then just remove the excess paste at the base and give it a little curve. So here's the method of making the orchid column. If you don't have a mold or don't want to buy one, you can make a perfectly good one without a mold. Same deal, make a little torpedo shape with your paste and insert the wire, and then carefully mold the paste around the base of the wire and remove the excess. I've rolled it between my palms and then flattened it out, and I'm now using a ball tool to hollow out the inside of the column. And then I'm narrowing out the shape with my fingers and giving it a little curve. As an optional detail, you can use a stitching wheel or use your Dresden tool to create two indentations along the back side of the column, and then just let that dry. We're now going to add some color before we add the throat section. And the column has these lovely little dots on the inside, so I'm going to use a dusting brush and also a fine paintbrush for this task. I'm beginning by adding some of the golden leaf petal dust, which is a really beautiful, vibrant yellow color, to the inside of the column and also the back side. You don't have to be especially precise with this. There isn't much of a rule. I'm mostly just looking at pictures of orchids and using them as my models. And then the lovely red plum color by Elite Color is getting added just to the back side and then a little down the sides of the front of the column. Now the fine detail paintbrush is going to come in handy here, and some burgundy airbrush color, or you can use burgundy gel color that's been diluted with a little bit of vodka or lemon extract to make an edible paint. And again, I'm using a picture of a real Cymbidium orchid as my model, and I'm just painting lots and lots and lots of tiny little dots inside of those indentations that I made with my Dresden tool. And I'm adding a few more delicate dots just on the back of the column that fade out for some extra detail. We're going to add the tiny little anther cap, which just sits at the tip of the column. with a ridiculously tiny little piece of white gum paste. Just add some water to the top of your column and add this little piece of white gum paste that you've separated into two sections with your Dresden tool. Just push it into place to make sure it's secure, and then you can let it dry. So the same process if you didn't use a mold to make your column for adding color. We're going to be adding the dots front and back, and then adding a little anther cap to the tip of the column, just with a tiny piece of white gum paste. I've managed to remove a few dots of burgundy color from the back while adding the anther cap, so I'm just going to paint those back on and then let the whole column dry. We're now going to use a mold to make the orchid throat, or the labellum. These molds look quite intimidating, but they have lovely details, so it's really worthwhile learning how to use them. Creating a ball of gum paste, adding a little cornstarch, and then rolling out a thickened ramp in the center of the paste, as you can see here. I'm using the throat cutter from my orchid cutter set to cut around that thickened section of paste and putting it on my foam pad, using a ball tool to soften the blunt cut edge of the throat without flattening that thickened area that we created. And you'll see on your orchid throat mold that there's an area in the front that's wider, and that's where the scalloped pieces of your cutout throat will go. Add the top section of the throat mold and give the whole thing a good press from all angles, all sides, to pick up as much detail as possible. Remove the top section of the mold and then use your Dresden tool just to lift up the back, open up the mold, and just lift up either side of the throat, and then gently remove it. And wow, you can see how much great texture it has acquired. Place that on the edge of your foam pad and use a cell stick, just rocked back and forth to hollow out those sections. You can trim any really straggly bits. And there you go. Your column, which is now dried and has all its coloring added, is going to meet up with the throat, as you see here. So to do that, we need to add some water or some edible glue just along the very edges of the back of the throat, as you can see here. Just take care not to oversaturate the throat. And then bring it up to the underside of your column. You can add some cornstarch to your fingers to prevent any sticking, and then just carefully adhere the sections that you glued onto your column. You'll want to let this column and throat dry, so bend a hook in the wire and stick it into a block of styrofoam to dry overnight ideally. And now we can add some color. There are so many different varieties of coloring for Cymbidium orchids. I'm going to go with the red plum and the golden leaf dust, along with this lovely peachy color called pumpkin by Crystal Colors. And I'm blending these colors together and using a little bit of cornstarch to aid in the blending process, and aiming for a peachy color that's deeper than the color of the paste, that also picks up on the beautiful veins that we created with our orchid veiner. And I'm applying the color in a sort of oval, as you can see here, with a lighter patch along the center of the petal and then two darker bands of color on either side. This is more of an art than a science, so again, you can use a real orchid or pictures of your favorite orchid in the coloring that you enjoy most as your guide when you're doing the dusting. I'm using some aubergine petal dust from Rollchem. You can use any plummy red color to get the same effect. And I'm using an edging brush just to scrape the color in from the very edge of the sepals in. and fading the color into that peach color that we added as a base. So that's the coloring for the sepals. So you'll make 3 of those. And then this is a petal. There are 2 of these for the orchid. I'm creating 3 very delicate streaks of the aubergine or plum color from the base, fading outwards toward the tip of the petal. We're now going to add some yellow to that raised pollen track at the center of the throat. And then we'll bring back the beautiful red plum color and fade that along the upper scalloped edge of the throat where it meets the column. So you'll do that on both sides. And these faded sections of plum color are the base for the deeper burgundy coloring that we're going to add shortly. I'm using a stock photo here of one of my favorite orchid varieties as my reference, and I'm using burgundy airbrush color by Americolor. You can also use burgundy gel color diluted with some lemon extract or some vodka to create a paint. This part is definitely an art, not a science. So use your real orchid or photos of the orchid that you love as a reference and put on some music that you enjoy or a podcast and just go for it. The one thing I will say about this process is that asymmetry and imperfection are not only fine, they're actually completely encouraged. There is not a single orchid out there in nature that is an exact clone of any other. And even an individual orchid is not completely symmetrical from one side to the other. So you are really aiming for some natural variations and a very, for lack of a better word, organic look. As an optional extra, you can dust a little green petal dust just at the base of each petal and sepal and add a few more of those burgundy dots for visual interest. You will want to create some half-width floral tape by taking a strip of regular floral tape, cutting it in half with scissors and stretching it out to activate the glue. And I'm using the half-width floral tape to tape over each of the wires of my petals and sepals. This step is important to prevent these components from shifting into a different position as you're trying to assemble the orchid. So it's very helpful to do this. Also, to add some stability to your orchid center, you can tape in another 20 gauge wire. And one final step is just to bend back your orchid center just a little with your pliers. And then we can move on to putting the orchids together. So the left arm and the right arm of the orchid, when you're looking at it from the front, are going to be added first. And those 2 are the petals, which are the ones that have the elongated leaf shape. So we made 2 of those, as you'll remember in the beginning. Tape those in place and tape down the wire. They tend to look a little like bunny ears. And now we're going to add the lower legs of the orchid, so the left leg and the right leg here with our tape. So these are 2 out of the 3 sepals that we made. Tape those into place, and then the last thing to add is the head of the orchid, or the last sepal, and that's the one that dried with the deepest curve on that chocolate egg mold, as you will recall. Then just tape down the wire to finish,
And I like to take a cell stick and just rub it along the tape to burnish it and create a nice smooth stem. Just a few final adjustments, and there you have it, your finished Cymbidium orchid.
Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please give us a like and please consider subscribing so that we can keep making more sugar flower and other baking tutorials for you. If you give these flowers a go, please share your work and tag us. We are at Honeycrumb Cakes on Instagram, and we would love to see what you do. If you have any requests for sugar flowers that you'd like to see next, please leave us a comment below. Check out the description box for a link to the tools and equipment that we use to make our Cymbidium orchids. And click here for our video overview of all the essential equipment and supplies that you need to be successful in making sugar flowers. We look forward to catching you in the next video. Cheers!